Hello everyone, this is Professor Gunner again, back with Natural and Artificial Environment. Unfortunately, my computer is not working very well, so I'm going to have to record this in audio format. But nevertheless, I hope that today I can give you an interesting lecture and that I give you something to think about. We're coming close to the end of the class here, and for these last two lectures, what I'd like to go over is metaphysics in Eastern philosophy, more specifically Chinese metaphysics. So I've asked you to read Franklin Perkins' Metaphysics in Chinese Philosophy entry from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So far, we've looked at a few different metaphysical views. We've looked at the contemporary scientific view, Freya Matthews' panpsychist spirituality, which is kind of in the domain of New Age philosophy, and Protestant Christian metaphysics. These views were all formulated within the Western lens, the Western worldview. But in these last two lectures, I'd like to take a dive into Eastern metaphysics. These metaphysical views are going to be based on different presumptions and perspectives on the nature of reality compared to Western philosophy. First, I'd like to give you some general notes on Chinese metaphysics, and then we'll go through the sections in this encyclopedia entry one by one, going a little bit over the history of Chinese metaphysics and some of its foundational ideas. So, let's begin. The first thing that I'd like to introduce to you about Chinese metaphysics is one of its foundational ideas, that all things are interconnected and constantly changing. This idea echoes some of those environmental views that we've already looked at in this class. Namely, that we exist as a part of an interconnected system that forms a kind of whole. In this way, all things are kind of related to each other and they influence one another. Actions and events don't happen in a vacuum, but instead the events, the processes, and the things of our reality form one interconnected and interdependent system. Similarly, Chinese metaphysics is also going to say that the universe is in flux. It is dynamic. There are things happening. This echoes the same idea that Heraclitus brought up when he said that a man never steps in the same river twice, because he is not the same man and it is not the same river. The idea here being that things are going on. Things are not permanent and unchanging, but rather the stuff of reality goes through certain processes. There's a certain dynamism to it. Chinese metaphysics is going to have the same basic idea. Another foundational view that informs it is that the stuff in the universe arises spontaneously from an ultimate source, which resists objectification and is immanent in the world. And there are a few different parts to this basic view. One, the stuff that exists in the universe comes from the same underlying ground or same underlying source. A fairly common feature of Eastern philosophies is that talking about this source of things or this underlying ground of reality is not something that can really be put into words, concepts, or categories. Instead, it's something that escapes our words, concepts, and categories. It is not a thing like a chair or a blanket or a tie is a thing, but rather it is something like a fountain, something that gives rise to everything else, from which everything else flows, but cannot really be captured with our human perspective. In this way, it resists objectification. Nevertheless, this source of reality is not a transcendent personal God, like we saw in Protestant Christian metaphysics. In that view, God exists outside of time and space and created the natural order that we see around us. Chinese metaphysical views are going to disagree with this. If they believe in God at all, they're going to basically say that God is nature, or God is this interconnected, interdependent, whole, unified system. In this way, the ultimate generative force or principle of reality is in and part of the world. It's a part of nature. It doesn't exist outside of it like the Christian God does. Things in the universe are, again, dynamically changing. They're going through various processes. Thus, the nature of existence is of vitality and growth. And this vitality and growth, this evolution, operates according to certain patterns. So there is a certain predictable orderliness to the way that things go. And these patterns and processes are cyclical. We could talk about the 4 seasons, the water cycle, the process of growth and decay and the recycling of nutrients. Basically, the universe operates according to patterns and principles that turn back on themselves, and that these patterns and principles can be observed and followed. Furthermore, these patterns and principles are influenced by polar forces. So we could talk about hot and cold. We could talk about positivity and negativity, like electromagnetism. This principle of polarity is symbolized with the Yin and Yang symbol, which I'm sure you have heard of or seen before. This symbol is meant to evoke the idea that basically, from our view, opposing forces inform one another, depend for their existence on one another, and influence those cyclical patterns and processes that make up the stuff of the universe. Thus, Franklin Perkins says, the author of this entry, this outlook differs from the assumptions that dominated metaphysical thinking in Europe after the introduction of Christianity. Western metaphysics has the belief that the ultimate principle of the world is transcendent but anthropomorphic, as human beings are made in its image, that the things of the world arise through design, and that the world is composed of ontologically distinct substances. End quote. In contrast, Chinese metaphysics is going to disagree with these foundational ideas. But where exactly did it come from? How did this originate? Well, Perkins goes into that in the first section of this entry. Is there metaphysics in Chinese philosophy? And the second section, proto-metaphysical background. In the first section, Perkins advises us against trying to use our Western concepts and definitions in order to explain what is going on in Chinese philosophy. See, this word metaphysics is something that has originated within the European Western philosophical tradition, and it can have a precise definition. But if we construe metaphysics broadly as investigating the nature of reality, its origins, how all of this stuff works, we can definitely say that Chinese philosophy too is metaphysical, because it tries to answer these fundamental underlying questions of the nature of the cosmos. Nevertheless, our exploration should avoid understanding Chinese philosophy through our Western frame. We can't help but do this, in a sense, because we've been conditioned into having a particular worldview with certain foundational ideas and concepts. But I'm going to try to explain some of this stuff in a way that doesn't rely on those foundational ideas. What are those concepts and categories that are kind of assumed in Western philosophy? Well, one of them is the dualistic nature of reality. See, in the West, we have all these different dualisms. We split the world up into these various binaries. There's good and evil. There is right and wrong, hot and cold, subject and object. We think that in reality there are things that are wholly other or alien with respect to other things. So there's a distinction between the body and the mind, or materiality and immateriality. There's a distinction between good and evil, and these things don't mix. They don't have anything to do with each other. And oftentimes we want one to win over the other. Well, Eastern philosophy is not going to accept these dualisms. It's going to make claims that there are different things in reality from the human perspective, but it's going to hold a non-dual view, or to use a Western term, a monistic view. Ultimately, it's going to say there aren't firm distinctions between things. Everything that we see in reality is part of one underlying connected interdependent unity or system. Similarly, Chinese philosophy is going to disagree with the Aristotelian logic that Western philosophy is based on. The prime example of this is what is known as the principle of non-contradiction. The principle of non-contradiction basically says a proposition or event or thing is a way and it is not another way. For example, if we say that a pen is black, it wouldn't make sense to say that the pen is also not black. No, that doesn't make sense, we think. It is either black or not black. Or that event happened or it didn't happen. Or the thing in front of me is either a book or it's not a book. Chinese philosophy isn't going to accept this basic principle. That is, it is not going to hold strongly to the principle of non-contradiction. In this way, its views about the world are going to be a little bit paradoxical, because it doesn't break up the world into these binary categories, and it doesn't hold strictly to the Aristotelian logic that Western philosophy does. Finally, we can say that Western philosophy and movements and schools of thought have placed an emphasis on thought and conceptualization, on proper belief. We can see this in the religion of Christianity, for example. What gets you into heaven? Well, it's having the proper belief, the proper mental state. Eastern philosophy is going to disagree with this. It's not so much about breaking up the world conceptually into the right categories, so much so as it is having proper experience. So it's going to privilege experience over thought, rather than thought over experience, which is how Western philosophy tends to go. Finally, in the West, distinctions are made between these theoretical domains and theoretical concepts and what people do in practice, how they act in their daily lives. But in Chinese philosophy and in the Chinese ways of life, there is actually supposed to be a marriage between theory and practice. What we're going to be talking about today through these Chinese metaphysics are not just these airy-fairy theoretical armchair philosophical ideas, but rather ideas that were meant to have practical import, that were meant to be practically applicable and used in people's daily lives. It might be helpful now to look into a little bit of the history of these ideas, where they come from and the historical context in which they emerged. Perkins notes that Until about the late 4th century BCE, Chinese philosophy focused on ethical and political philosophy, the two primary philosophical movements emerging from the Mohists and the Confucians. According to these thinkers and practitioners, what was of prime import was understanding how to behave with other people, how to engage in the proper rituals so that one lived an ethical and virtuous life. But Chinese metaphysics, trying to answer the basic questions of the underlying nature of reality, did eventually emerge from the Tao Te Ching and other associated texts. It was these texts that developed the idea of Tianming, or the mandate of heaven, which has come to form the backbone of Chinese metaphysics. Coming from Tian, meaning literally heavens or sky, the mandate of heaven argued that there are certain patterns or principles that the universe operates according to. And that if humans wanted to be successful and live good lives, they should try to emulate these patterns. The Chinese thinkers, however, didn't see the heavens as being a different dimension from our reality, though, like Christian philosophy might. Instead, again, they conceived of the universe as one interconnected natural system. So the heavens or sky, in this view, was not external to the system of nature, although it was meant to be expressed through human action. Thus, the success of human life, it was argued, is determined by whether one lives in accordance with these patterns, whether one had the proper awareness of their situation, of what was going on around them, whether they embodied the proper preferences and acted out the proper values. So there was a very strong insistence on, thinking and living in the right way. And the general idea was that if someone did this, they would live a good and happy life. The problem was that Chinese society entered into a very politically unstable and chaotic period. In the 4th century BCE, we saw the collapse of the Zhou dynasty, and there was a lot of political instability. During the Warring States period, there were a bunch of different city-states vying for power and control. A lot of different groups and warlords trying to get one over on other people to increase their power and their wealth and their land. And so some people came to view the mandate of heaven as suspicious, and they began to doubt it. They really began to question, if I live my life ethically and properly according to these principles, am I really guaranteed to have a good and happy life? Well, some people came to think, no, this isn't true. It doesn't really matter how I live. There are all these forces outside of my control that, are going to influence me to have a certain kind of life, whether I want it or not. 3 responses came to explain how and why these bad things were happening. The Mohist position tried to defend the mandate of heaven. They tried to defend the view that heaven rewarded those who are good and cared for others. The second response, what I'm going to call the naturalist position, basically argued the same thing that the contemporary scientific view in the West argues. That the events of nature, good and bad things, come, quote, without reason and without concern for justice, unquote. The operations of nature are amoral, and sometimes things just happen. The third response came in the form of what I'm going to call the Taoist position. And this position argued that while nature operates according to amoral patterns, the fate of humans is largely within their own control. So one can decide to use their free will how they want to, and if they use it properly, well, they have a large amount of control over how their life ends up. In any case, Perkins says, quote, "The belief that nature follows consistent patterns that can guide human action became a dominant view across Chinese philosophies, while the relationship between these patterns and humanistic values became one of the main points of dispute." Arising then out of this tumultuous period, this warring states period, we saw Daoism and other schools of thought. And it was due to this, probably in the middle of the 4th century BCE, that Chinese philosophy took a turn more explicitly towards metaphysics in vocabulary, concerns, and visions of the universe, what Perkins calls a cosmogonic turn. These thinkers and texts began to explore how the stuff of the universe arose, what its origins were, how it took form, and what all this stuff is. And this cosmogonic turn represented a shift in Chinese philosophy away from human concerns and the anthropomorphic lens towards a more naturalistic, zoomed-out view of how all of this got here and how it works. Perkins outlines 4 basic assumptions or perspectives that constitute this cosmogonic turn. 1, the things of the universe come from a single source. 2, the things of the universe arise spontaneously, without design or purpose. 3, the source of this generation is immanent in reality and accessible. And 4, the space or the stuff between ultimate reality and the multiplicity of the universe, the things of it, there are polarities and cycles operating in that space. To try to unpack this a little bit more, I'm going to bring in now some Western views and concepts to make sense of the basic Chinese metaphysical views. Firstly, we can say that Chinese metaphysics is non-dual, or to use a Western term, monistic. These thinkers believe that the universe is one interconnected system. And in Daoism, for example, the word that is used to describe this natural system is the Tao. The way, the course, the process, or the flow of nature. The general idea is that all of the stuff of the universe basically forms an interconnected, interdependent whole. All of this stuff comes from one source, and in Western terms, there's one substance that makes up the stuff in the universe. Although there is a distinction made between, in the philosophy, what is called being and non-being, basically all the stuff in the cosmos forms one large interconnected system. Being, you, arises from non-being, wu, or what we might call undifferentiatedness. It's difficult to speak about the source of things, this ultimate source of being, because it is not a thing like a table, a chair, a rock, or a plant is a thing. This undifferentiated fountain of what exists, we might use fountain imagery to describe it, is not something that can be captured with words, concepts, or categories. It doesn't fit into any of those things. Like Western apophatic theology, then, we might say that no positive descriptor completely applies to it. It escapes any positive characterization. In any case, just as sound emerges from silence, just as the empty space within a jar is what makes the jar useful, the things of reality emerge from non-being, or the ultimate ground of reality. This leads Chinese metaphysics into having a particular cosmology. The things of the universe, they say, arise spontaneously from this undifferentiated source. What this means is that, in contrast to Western views of the world and Western theology, the stuff of the universe was not created or designed with a particular purpose in mind. In fact, the Chinese metaphysicians don't think that there exists a God that exists outside of time and space, a creator God that made everything, who has a certain plan for how things are going to go, and who made things with a particular teleology in mind. Instead, the things that we see around us in the universe operate according to a particular internal pattern or principle, or they operate according to their own nature, Zuan. The phrase that Perkins used to describe this in the entry is things operate of themselves or of their own accord. Thus, everything in existence, the nature of its existence is to dynamically grow and evolve and change. We can consider the Tao, or the way, the process, or the flow of nature to be the processes and the events of what's happening. Everything is in flux, everything is changing, there is an impermanence to it. But also, the reason why a plant does what a plant does, a tree does what a tree does, a human does what a human does, is because it has a particular nature that spurns it towards evolution and growth, an inner principle or force. This leads us into the Chinese metaphysical concept of imminence. In Western philosophy, especially Christianity, for example, the general view is that God exists outside of nature. God exists outside of time and space. God is the one who brought it all into existence. And he oversees its operations, but he's not a part of nature. In contrast, Eastern philosophy, if they think a God exists at all, they're likely going to liken God with nature. In Western terms, this is what we call a pantheistic view. They identify God with the process or the whole of nature. Consequently, the Chinese metaphysicians are going to say that the ultimate ground of reality, or the Tao, the course, the flow, the process of nature, is immanent in all things. It is in all things. And it is that force or energy or principle that is holding stuff in existence and pushing it towards evolution and growth. What this means is that ultimately our universe, again, is one interconnected dynamic system. Everything is a part of the Tao. There is no stepping outside of it. The Tao is in everything. There isn't some transcendent God or creator, planner who exists outside of time and space. There is something like a source internal to all things and processes that are moving it along. This is why Perkins says, quote, "Since the self-so spontaneity to which Tao refers is always present," and I might add, it's in everything, What is required is a negative process of removing obstacles. To put this into perspective, we can consider the ancient Chinese philosophy of Daoism. Daoism says the Tao is what generates everything. The Tao is what is moving everything along, and everything is a part of it. Thus, we might say that each individual thing in the universe, from our perspective, tables and chairs and plants and rocks and animals, they are all different forms or manifestations of the Tao, but they are all a part of it, and they are all ultimately it. Consequently, the Taoists are going to say, if we would just allow things to naturally go their own way, if we allow the plant to grow how it's going to grow, if we allow the water to flow how it's going to flow, if we allow the animals to do what they're going to do naturally, if we let all these things happen, if we get out of the way, then the harmony of the universe will be established. They locate the problem of our suffering and our ills in forcing things, in trying to grasp and control, in trying to upset the natural order of the universe. Hence the quote, "What is required is a negative process of removing obstacles." What we get from this is that, according to the Taoists, the best way to live is to go with the flow. We should work, they're going to say, to intelligently comprehend the processes of the universe so that we can move with it and we can use its energy to accomplish what we need to do without having to go against the grain or go against the tide and putting in as little effort as possible. This is what it means to go with the flow and live with the process of nature. To better break down how the stuff of the universe works, it might be a good idea to discuss just a little bit more this idea of polarity that I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture. Chinese metaphysics argues that the things of the universe change, grow, and evolve through the interactions of polar forces. So, they would say in the universe we have things like hot and cold, positive charge and negative charge. We have these different elements that, from our point of view, are oppositional or in conflict with one another. But the Chinese metaphysicians are going to say that all of these oppositions actually are interdependent and interconnected. Hot cannot exist without cold. Wet cannot exist without dry. Evil cannot exist without good. These things go together. And the operations of the universe are informed by processes, you might say, oscillating between these two forces or between these poles. Similarly, they're going to say that the processes of nature are cyclical and, according to Perkins, constitute, quote, processes of return. In other words, our universe operates according to cycles. We could talk about the 4 seasons, right? We could talk about the motions of the planets. The planets in our solar system operate according to a certain cyclical pattern. We go around the sun, and that produces the 4 seasons. And how does life work on Earth? Well, things get nutrients and minerals from the environment. Let's say a plant. A plant takes those vitamins, minerals, and nutrients and grows. It takes that energy and uses it to build itself up. And then eventually the plant gives its energy to something else. Either a bug eats it, or it dies, and it is recycled back into the soil. So there is an ongoing process of growth and decay that makes life possible. The planets revolve around the sun. The 4 seasons continue to go on of their own accord. The human body undergoes certain cyclical processes of growth and decay, of cells splitting off and then dying and splitting off and dying. There's digestion. There's the normal human life of being asleep and then being awake, being asleep and being awake. Thus, there are all these cycles that are operating in our universe. They all work together to form a large interconnected system, and this oscillatory nature of the universe explains their sustainability, their permanence in impermanence, and the fact that we can predict things because things operate according to certain patterns. Finally, we can bring in one more concept that is central to Chinese metaphysics, and that has to do with multiplicity and indifferentiation. In Western philosophy, we make hard and fast distinctions between things. We say good is different than evil, and it's separate from it, and we want good to triumph. We say tables are different than chairs. Computers are different from mugs. Animals are different than humans. Books are different than pens. We make all of these distinctions, and we think that our universe is populated by all of these things of different kinds. Likewise, we say the mind is different from the body, or the spirit is different than the flesh. But Chinese metaphysics is going to disagree with this. They're going to say, from our point of view, we see all of these things that we think are different, but they are all manifestations of the Tao at the end of the day. The Tao manifests itself in different forms. It manifests itself in different kinds of patterns, in different processes, but ultimately, there is no distinction between things. Different things exist from our point of view, depending on context, our frame of mind, our worldview. But everything is a manifestation of the Tao. The Tao is in everything, and it all together forms an interconnected, interdependent system. This view is in direct opposition to those Western ontological dualisms that I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture. In Chinese metaphysics, there is no ultimate distinction between good and evil, between subject and object, between high and low, or right and left. All of these dualisms go together. The poles of those dualisms, the extremes, depend on each other for their existence, and they couldn't exist any other way. If the whole world was good and there was no evil, there would be no such thing as good, because good exists in relation to evil and depends upon evil. Right exists in relation to left, high to low, and subject to object. Thus, everything that we see around us, although it operates according to its own particular nature, or Xing, each thing that we see is just one form or manifestation of the Tao. In thought, then, and also in practice, the Taoists are going to emphasize non-duality and impartiality. They're going to say, once you intuitively grasp and act as though you are a part of this interconnected, interdependent unity, then you're going to be able to live in harmony with the universe. Recognition of the oneness of things is what is going to be important for a fulfilled and happy life. In contrast to the other metaphysical views that we've looked at so far, then, Chinese metaphysics, like Daoism, is non-dual or monistic. It's naturalistic. It thinks that everything is basically a part of nature. And we might call it pantheistic, such that it doesn't believe a creator God exists that's outside nature, but this interconnected, interdependent system is it. According to Chinese metaphysics, then, everything that exists is natural, because everything comes from the Tao and participates in the Tao and manifests the Tao. But trying to force things to be a different way, or meddling or intervening in things, goes against the natural order. So that would be an example of artificiality. When humans try to control and grasp and make things go in a way that they wouldn't naturally go. Thus, their orientation towards the world, their philosophy of life, you might say, is such that humans should move in accordance with the Tao. They should go with the flow of the universe. They should harmonize themselves with the processes of nature. That basically summarizes some of the foundational views and ideas that underlie Chinese metaphysics. I hope you found this lecture interesting, and I hope it's given you something to think about. If you have any questions or concerns, don't hesitate to let me know. Otherwise, I will see you next time in the last lecture. Thank you very much. Bye.